Thank you very much for inviting me again to come to the AIC conference. And I do actually today want some help. And I want to be really open with you about some of the challenges we face. But I do want to start, if I could, with a very blunt advertorial for some people who just don't know all the areas, not all the areas, the broad range of work we engage with at AHDB. So if you forgive me just a minute of an advertorial. So being fit for the future, accepting that we face enormous change, I think would be the backdrop I would use. When I look at what's going on around the world today, and I joked about how long I've been interviewed by Charlotte over the years, to see where we are today with a trade war between the United States, the massive disruption to global markets, the President of the United States tearing up climate change agreements. We've got people in Salisbury being poisoned by President Putin, who, by the way, comes from the country that is the biggest exporter of wheat now in the world. We are living, I think, in absolutely crazy times. Times when I look at those global challenges, climate change, the fires we see in California as we speak, the weather we've experienced around the world this summer, the water scarcity challenge that repeats and was widely covered about the impact that had in South Africa. The global demand, and every time I look at the wheat harvest figures, the maize figures for each given year, isn't it staggering how the demand keeps moving up? And this year, of course, for the first time in 6 years, we've actually produced less than we've consumed of wheat around the world. Global stocks are held by countries that are pretty unlikely to release them. Today, China holds just under half all the wheat stocks in the world. Then you look into the fact that, for me, for the last 45 years, a big part of our food security has been part of the EU. Just over 70% of all our food imports come from the European Union, where, who knows where this will end, is the source of that stability in our markets, those supply chains that have been built up over those 45 years. But even then, the EU is still an importer of food from an area the size of Germany. Couple that with the protectionism that we see now unraveling around the world and those global politics I showed in the previous slide, this is a crazy place. Rather than just having me as a loudmouth farmer from Biggleswade telling you this, I've got another clip. And to always try and flatter my chairman, I've got an audio clip from a really good radio programme that Charlotte Smith presented in the spring. I've always thought it pays to try and get them on site. Bear with me a second, it's a short clip from the global harvest that Charlotte presented in the spring.
But some argue that the more complex food chains become and the more reliant we are on food from afar, then the more vulnerable we become.
I think in general, there isn't a huge awareness of how complex the food supply system is. There probably isn't an awareness of all the things that go wrong in our very, very complicated food supply system. So there is vulnerabilities from that perspective.
Professor Chris Elliott from Queen's University, Belfast.
One of the things that our institute here of global food security does at Queen's, we track crop failures in different parts of the world. And what we can absolutely see is because of the changing climatic conditions we have, particularly in different parts of the world, we can see more and more crop failures. Now, whenever there is a crop failure, that means there is a perturbation in supply and demand, and that will force prices up, or I think in the future will lead to us being short of some food commodities.
And what difference will that make to the complexity of the food system? Will that put pressure on it to change it, or will the affluent countries just buy their way out of trouble?
Population of the world is about 7.5 billion currently, and predicted to rise to 10 billion. We have dwindling resources. We're losing land because of climate change. So the pressures on our food system currently are enormous. Will we be able to buy our way out of trouble? Well, that's certainly what we're doing at the moment. But when I look to the world markets, I can see growing affluence in China, growing affluence in India. So, we will be competing against very, very big and probably richer nations going forward.
At what point do you think consumers will actually notice that?
The first thing that people will notice is you go into your supermarket and you'll see some commodities that you expect to be there and they won't be. And that will be because of crop failure somewhere in the world, and the UK food system hasn't been able to source it from anywhere else. And that will happen over the next few years, I can guarantee it.
So not just me from Biggleswade telling you about those global challenges, that's Professor Chris Elliott from the Centre for Global Food Security at Queen's Belfast. He makes really powerful points about the complexity of our supply chains. Which brings me to yet another initiative. And what I do really want to focus on in the next 10 or 15 minutes is about the fact that we have an opportunity, and I was talking to Alison beforehand about how some of the policies that came out of the coalition government have been carried on post-2015 by the Conservatives. And the whole notion of industrial strategy, of actually involving government in trying to make businesses more successful, was something that Conservative thinking had rejected. It's a definite turn back to almost Edward Heath times of wanting to have activism, of getting involved in trying to make sectors more competitive, more productive, more efficient. If you picked up some of the messages coming out of the Treasury, the biggest challenge facing the UK today is a tapering down of productivity, our losing ground against key competitors. So to have, and we've seen these in automotive, we've seen them in pharmaceuticals, we've seen sector councils created by government to basically engage, and I'll come to a bit more detail about how we do that, try and make those sectors more competitive and more productive. So to have the Food and Drink Sector Council, sorry, I was going to go back to the first slide, where we actually have right across government buy into the objective, where you have bays with Greg Clark, with Michael Gove. I'm not sure that's the most flattering photograph of the Secretary of State on the top there, but setting about to act, as it says really clearly, to act as a sector council representing right across farm to fork in partnership with government to improve productivity and sustainability of the industry. We want to provide, and the ambition is to provide industry-led solutions, partnerships between governments, something I don't think that was being talked about before Vince Cable, was Secretary of State at Bays. And this is right across, engaging relevant government departments, and you can see this happening from Home Office around labour, to schools and education, to DCLG if it comes to planning in other areas. And the fact that government says food and drink is up there with some of those other sectors creates an opportunity. What I'm nervous about, as I look at some of the faces that have been around a long time, is people say, yet another initiative. And I'm conscious that if we are going to have a food and drink sector, we have got a food and drink sector council, it's really important that we make it work and it makes a difference. And that's what I want to spend a few moments, as I say, talking about going through right now. I think we have to acknowledge that we have an agricultural challenge. I was joking with the new boss of AIC, Rob, beforehand, that we can't sit here and just tell ourselves that everything's fine. We've got brilliant companies here in the room this morning. But whether we like it or not, Our other competitors, and if these figures are the top line of our agricultural total factor productivity of 0.9% is a period, I think, from 2000 to 2014, we've been losing ground massively compared to key competitors in the Netherlands and the United States. Agricultural productivity, labour productivity has not been moving forward. If I look around East Anglia, our dependency on chemical agriculture, when I look at the blackgrass problems we have, the message Manette gave this morning about our loss of neonicotinoids, we have as an industry massive challenges. And we need to think about how we can come together and find solutions. We have created an agricultural productivity working group. There are many people in this room involved in that, trying to help us identify what's going wrong. We've cast the net incredibly widely. I'll come to an invitation in a moment. We need people to say where they see problems, where they see bottlenecks, where they see solutions for the farming industry. But we do want to be really ambitious. And when I show those numbers before of where the Netherlands, where the United States have been moving forward ahead of us, we want to be ambitious to make sure that we're competing. And I think there's a really big challenge here. One, I think amongst the farming industry, and maybe, if I can be bold, even in this room, that we accept the challenge that we're losing ground, that other countries are doing better than we are. The Secretary of State always carefully crafts a sentence, we have some of the best farmers in the world, and then goes on to do the challenging bit afterwards. Of course we have. There's some really great examples. But we have to acknowledge the numbers, and collectively we need to have an ambition to want to do something about it. And I think that needs a change of thinking. So, it is an invitation. To say to everybody in this room, those who want to get on the email or come to meeting stakeholder groups that we're trying to put together, is to say, if we had a blank sheet of paper, what would the industry look like in 10 years' time? How should it get there? What is our collective role in change? Where does government need to play a role? And I think those two middle ones of what is the collective role in change and what is the role of government is really important to farming. Because if you were comparing ourselves with the automotive industry, you could probably get 6 people into a room and you'd have 80% of production. And they've turned to government and said, we're going to do this, and it could well be 80% of the work that's being proposed. But we need government to do this 20% on the side here. It might be better communications, it might be better infrastructure, it might be around skills and apprenticeships, access to labour. The concern I have in farming is if we don't just reverse it the other way, but we say actually 95% of it's down to government and only 5% of it down to ourselves as farmers. And that goes back to my point about being really honest with ourselves about what other countries are doing and how we sit alongside them. Collaborative working to make UK agriculture more successful, and I'm conscious again as members of AIC, this might be perceived as a challenge. I think it's an opportunity. And how do we get round some of those private agendas to get a collective approach to wanting UK agriculture to be the best? And when we look at those challenges, why wouldn't we want to have more productive agriculture, more capacity here in the UK, particularly when you look at those challenges I highlighted early on? There are 13 different work streams, and God, do I regret just throwing the net really widely and not being focused enough to start with. But we have pulled this down to 3 key areas, and I can see Jeremy Moody in there singing where does the bit about access to land fit, which Jeremy's helping us with as well. But we've got 3 emerging areas we're trying to put the bits of work that's going on at the moment under. What works for agriculture, skills, AI, data, and robotics. And again, as I say, there are a number of people in the room who are helping us with that. What works is, it's got me a bit baffled, so I'm going to be really honest with you and try and give you a bit of background to what works. It is a concept of an organisation which is designed around the needs of industry. It independently reviews advice and recommends best practice. It's a one-stop shop for resource and information, links science to practitioners. Anybody who's heard people talking around farming and how we get the best research and development linked into being adopted by able practitioners on farms knows we do have a problem in this area. It is about how we have expertise, communicate and access and pick that up with practitioners, as I said, on farm. The truth is, what works, and look, I would ask any of you to try and get involved in the workshops, but I'd also ask you to go onto the government website, which is www.gov UK Guidance What Works Networks. Why? Because since 2013, this has been a government initiative, concept. It already includes areas like NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence. One that ought to make us sit up and take note is the What Works Centre is actually the Education Endowment Foundation, something Michael Gove locked into, picking up what worked best in schools to make the difference to learning and outcomes. It also covers What Works Centre for Reduction of Crime, for crime reduction, is another one of those What Works Centres. It's worth looking at as we try and see how we, as the farming industry, can take note of that opportunity, which I think government's looking to. It came out of actually the nudge centre that David Cameron was really keen on, about how you made change happen with government. I think we need to look really carefully at how we make sure you have, and Andrew, when you did your introduction at the start, science-based policy, I think Nick touched on it as well. How do we have scientific rigour, independence, objectivity? Dynamic analysis, review of the available evidence, identification of gaps that drive to fundamental research centre. I still think, as an industry, we're not clear enough about the areas that make the biggest difference on farm and how we get the right research spending in those areas. I'm going to be careful in saying this, but sometimes we find research is being driven into areas that is popular with researchers and not always in the areas that makes the biggest difference on my farm for my business. Of course there's great stuff going on, but we have limited resources, and how do we target that to make the biggest possible difference? Open and accessible. And I think there's a real opportunity, going back to that linkage to Michael Gove and the education example of what works, by doing this right. Science, as Andrew said again, can help make the right policy as we move forward. And that's what I think gives us a real opportunity. So that's enough about what works. Please look at it. You know, I'll give my email address, and Jonathan Burney, who's acting as a secretariat to the Agricultural Productivity Work Group, our email address is, please communicate with us. We need to be told where there are flaws. We need to be told where you think this could make additional difference to help us. Future skills is another area. I talked about skills. This is a really difficult challenge for farming. Acknowledging that we need to up our game. I was talking before in the coffee break about the quality of the advice that comes onto farm. The better the skills we have on farms, the easier it is to partner with that advisor to make sure we get the right outcomes. And if you look at what's happening in other countries around Europe, whether it's in the Republic of Ireland or France, grants increasingly are being made conditional on skills training amongst farmers. So if you want to access a lucrative grant to make an investment, it is conditional on either you being qualified or you undertaking professional benchmarking and further training, taking part in learning groups. And I think how we nudge the industry to move towards a professional qualification, and I know Minette's had to disappear, is something we need to think about. Because actually, when we look at the next generation coming, and I was really glad AIC have got students here today, we need to give that professionalism the status and try and make sure that this industry is viewed as valuable, not some rough old bloke chewing straw saying how bad life is all the time. Changing the perceptions of what a great career farming can be ought to be our ambition around skills. The last area around the Food and Drink Sector Council we're trying to link towards is AI, data and robotics. There was a picture or a short bit of the video at the start showing the plants being moved about by robots. I just think this is mind-blowing. It's fantastic. It's exciting. What we can be doing in the coming years with robots, what we might be able to move. And I don't mean to scare Hutchinsons over this, but as we move from a chemical-based agriculture, whether it's laser technology, whether it's robotics, whether it's biological solutions, being able to analyze data in phenomenal data, I think will drive the next agricultural digital revolution that we are on the brink of. So all of those areas are looking for input from those of you in this room who are experts. I'm going to give you my contact details. Jonathan Burney is the person who's leading on that. I repeat that I'm really nervous that people say this is yet another initiative. But let me, again, repeat what I said. We've got cross-government buy-in to a sector council for the food and drink industry from farm to fork. This isn't just about saying, what are you going to do? It's about what can we do as we prepare for the biggest shake-up in agricultural support since 1947. How do we make the most of it? I think there are, and I know the title of the conference about opportunities. When you look at that global challenge, rising populations, changing incomes around the world, climate change. If I was 30 years younger, what a brilliant time to be going into farming. Let's make sure we create the right environment. Thank you very much indeed.